My name is Gary Marks. I'm the pastor emeritus of the Church of the Pilgrimage in Plymouth. I'm also a member of the 400th anniversary committee, that 400th anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower in 2020. I'm on the faith subcommittee, and I have been a college professor and do a lot of preaching and lecturing about the Pilgrims of Plymouth. The Pilgrims founded their church and their whole existence really on a covenant, which was a biblical idea, but after having rejected all the forms of the Church of England and indeed the state, the covenant was the foundational first principle of their existence together. They drew up the covenant in 1606 in a speck of a place called Scrooby in England, and thereby became separatists. They separated from the Church of England because they were based upon a covenant, which means that each party agrees with the other to operate on certain principles. They created a kind of proto-democracy in that each person who was a member of that covenanted church could have a say in the way they made their decisions. This, for them, was exclusive to their own congregation, but it had a universal tendency that got put into place when they landed in Plymouth. After a long and arduous journey and many frustrations along the way, they finally became a covenanted community, and the idea of the covenant expanded itself into the social order, became the Mayflower Compact, and they extended the covenant notion to everything they did, eventually into civil and judicial affairs. And it was a grand experiment. And while not equivalent to the Constitution, it at least was a seed, a stepping stone, Bradford said, unto more important work yet to be done. The covenant always expressed that God had more to do with them than any one given time. They walked in the ways made known or to be made known to them. And that's an important thing, because there is a kind of evolution in the meaning of democracy. The Pilgrims, following the advice of their pastor, who remained in Leyden because the greater number of people of the congregation were unable to come on the first voyage, they were advised by Robinson to advertise themselves as friendly. When they got here, although they did not have a full-fledged understanding of the native peoples, they nevertheless met with Massasoit in about 1621 and formed an agreement. Winslow and the chiefest among them, as Bradford says, got together in a partially built house in Plymouth at the plantation. It was the common house at the time, and drew up an agreement that one would act toward the other in honorable ways. And this was a covenant with the native peoples. It didn't last for long, but in Plymouth, there was a fairly decent understanding between the Native Americans and the Pilgrims as being mutually beneficial one to the other. This collapsed after 53 years, but the agreement, the extension of the covenant by the Pilgrims to the native peoples did last for 53 years, which is a relatively long period of time. The Pilgrims at first were a congregation unto themselves based upon the covenant. But when the covenant got extended into the civil sphere and the compact, it was not just church people who were not just members who were a part of the covenant. all the people on the Mayflower were a part of that covenant, whether they were religious or not, which is a very interesting thing, that their notion of self-governance got transferred to a wider audience. The Pilgrims were not the majority on the Mayflower. People don't really understand that. Not all were of the Pilgrim Church. So that agreement, once extended, got more developed as time went on, and communities outside of Plymouth were founded and formed. And indeed, as Bradford says in his wonderful quotation, that the truth and light of Robinson's Truth and Light has more light and truth yet to come. And so this democratic notion, which they did not intend, they did not come here to establish democracy, but because of the way they organized themselves, democracy was the way they worked. It's the job that they assigned themselves to do. So that every agreement reached was to be sacred. It was to be honorable and honored, whether you were of the church or not. It was a gift from God, this notion of free, independent people. This notion is greatly lost on our society today, I think. We have lost the sacredness of our ancestry and the sacredness of life itself, and the communities that we form based upon agreements, which, whether you were of the church or not, were meant to be sacred and indeed gifts from God. The agreements that were reached, like the Mayflower Compact, whether you were a member of the church or not, were also intended to be sacred. That is, once they're made, they are to be honored and honored in full. That idea seems to be lacking in our society today. We, I think, make agreements, but people don't seem to mind breaking those agreements in this day and time. That would have been anathema to these people that we call the Pilgrims. They believed in the sacredness of what they were doing, and that sacredness was extended into every area of their life and their lives together, and including the Native Americans at first, an idea that worked very well. They were about a sacred business, but the sacredness was not isolated to themselves. They believed there was, with Robinson, their pastor, yet more truth and light to break forth from God's holy word, and that they were on the way. They had not yet arrived at the full destiny of their calling in this world. There was yet more truth and light. There was yet one stepping stone unto another generation, because no generation, they understood, no generation can solve all the mysteries of all time, and they understood that, and they were open to a new beginning. They were open to a new future. And later, as time went by, it became very inclusive of all people. We should not think that the Mayflower Compact, for instance, an extension of the church covenant, was a kind of constitution in the sense that evolved, but at least it paved the way. It was a stepping stone for self-governance. Well, Europeans in general had a badly mistaken understanding of native peoples. Many of them were referred to as savages, or little more than animal life, I guess. It's a terrible thing. But the Pilgrims, once they were here, had an appreciation for who the native peoples were. And they got along, as I mentioned, for 53 years based on an agreement, a compact, a covenant. Winslow and Massasoit became good friends. Winslow walked all the way over to Sowams in what is now Rhode Island and treated Massasoit when he was sick. We don't know what he did or what he mixed up, but Massasoit recovered. And their friendship lasted throughout the life of Winslow. Massasoit outlived all the major figures of the Mayflower: Bradford, Brewster, Winslow, Fuller, all those people. And he held them in honorable esteem. There were disagreements, but there are disagreements with every group, no matter what it is. And look at the way the world is divided today and the terrible things that are happening and occurring in the world, from Iraq to Ukraine, and between Israel and the Palestinians. The Pilgrims would have tried to have avoided that. And if every agreement had been as sound as it was, even with the native peoples at first, those kind of things might have been resolved. Later, that wore away, and Bradford, before he passed this mortal life, was regretful that the principles of self-governance and the principles of the covenant were being abandoned, even at that early. But so long as they lived without other people coming here, they did well with the Native Americans, and vice versa. There's even an instance where a European was hanged for mistreating a native. So that would not happen later, that's for sure. But it did for them. It was a sacred and mutual agreement for the benefit one of the other. The Pilgrims considered all agreements to be sacred. That was the only sacred thing there was. And that applied whether it was to other Europeans or to Native Americans. It was sacred. The idea of mutual benefit one to the other was universal in its application for them. The Pilgrims at the time would not have thought that they were making a cultural exchange per se. The fact was, though, that they were. They learned certain things from the native peoples and respected that. They also wanted to contribute to the native peoples as well, so that there was a cultural exchange. It's just that the cultures were so vastly different from one another. But they eventually worked things out, but only for that 53 years in Plymouth. I think that the Pilgrims have been greatly misunderstood, especially as interpreted from the 20th century, 21st century. There was a historian who once said, every present gives us an absolutely new past. That is, we're always judging previous times by our own standards in our own day and time. The Pilgrims, while maybe unwittingly with the native peoples, at least for that brief little window of time, did work things out that made a positive contribution to the development of this nation. It was in its nascency, it was in its infancy, and they may have not thought of it in that term. They also thought it was their duty to try to convert the native peoples to the Christian faith. But they also learned to appreciate the faith or the religious foundation of the native culture, so that they never really beat people over the head about that. In their worldview, the greatest thing would be for all people to receive grace and to receive direction and hope for their future. So inadvertently, they did culturally mix with the native peoples, who had no understanding of their God, nor did the Europeans have much of an understanding of the natives' gods. But they created positive results, and they did so peacefully, at least for 53 years.